I've always found comfort in early mornings, the kind that most people sleep through, when the world is still half asleep and quiet hangs in the air like a held breath. That's when I roll out of bed, pull on my faded hoodie, and fire up the old diesel engine of my bread truck. I'm 27, single, and probably the youngest guy in the neighborhood who doesn't work behind a laptop screen or in some high-rise downtown. While most folks in this HOA-managed suburb of Fairmeadow are busy trimming their hedges to regulation height or arguing on Facebook over mailbox paint colors, I'm loading up crates of sourdough and multi-grain loaves ready to make deliveries that actually matter. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be driving a bread truck. I had other plans once: college, a music degree, maybe a band, but life had other ideas. When my dad passed unexpectedly, I dropped everything to take care of my mom and younger sister. We needed the income fast, so I took the only job that would hire me without a degree and zero experience night shift driver for Sunrise Baking Company. Eventually, I saved up, bought my own secondhand delivery truck, and struck a deal to do freelance runs for bakeries and nonprofits. Then the fires hit. 3 towns over, a wall of flames devoured an entire valley in a single weekend. Families lost everything: homes, jobs, pets. The emergency shelters overflowed, and the county reached out to every food service within 100 miles. A friend who works with disaster response texted me, "You still got that bread truck?" That was how it began. Within days, I was running supplies to churches turned shelters, school gyms stuffed with cots, and exhausted volunteers handing out bottled water and baby formula. I didn't post about it, didn't take selfies for social media clout. I just drove, sometimes 14 hours straight, sometimes into neighborhoods where the sky was still hazy with smoke. All I wanted was to help, and maybe in a small way, honor my dad, who was the kind of man who'd stop to change a stranger's tire in the rain. By the time things calmed down, I had developed a sort of route Monday through Friday. I'd pick up fresh loaves from 2 local bakeries that donated extras. Then I'd make deliveries to distribution points the county flagged as in need. Saturdays were for repairs and restocking. Sundays, I let the truck sleep. That was the rhythm of my life. I never expected anyone to notice. And then came the complaints. The first was subtle: a printed notice left in my mailbox with no signature, just Fairmeadow HOA letterhead and a vaguely threatening line. Per HOA guidelines, commercial vehicles may not be parked overnight in residential driveways. I remember standing there, paper in hand, staring at my own cracked driveway, like it had suddenly become a crime scene. My bread truck was parked neat and quiet beside my tiny garage. I hadn't blocked anyone's access. It didn't leak oil. It wasn't covered in graffiti or blasting music. It just sat there, faded white paint, a few rust spots, a small feeding relief sticker on the bumper. I tossed the notice in the trash. A week later, another one came, this time with an actual threat. Failure to remove said vehicle within 48 hours may result in daily fines and/or towing. That's when I started noticing her. Karen. You know the type. Perfect manicure. Sunglasses too big for her face. Always walking on her tiny Pomeranian like she owned every inch of the sidewalk. She didn't wave when we passed. She narrowed her eyes. One morning, I caught her taking photos of my truck on her phone, then tapping furiously like she was reporting me to some cosmic HOA overlord. I tried to keep my head down. I figured maybe if I explained things would chill out. I even dropped by the HOA's community office during their posted hours, but the place was locked, blinds drawn. No response to my emails, no callbacks. And so I kept driving, kept delivering, kept doing what I knew was right. Until the morning she called the cops. It was a Wednesday, I remember, because it was bulk bread day, 2 bakeries were overstocked, and I had to load up more than usual. I started early around 5:00 a.m., and by 6:15, I was back double-checking the straps on a fresh shipment before heading to a shelter in Riverglen. The truck was parked in front of my house, engine idling, while I grabbed coffee from the porch. That's when I saw her, Karen, standing halfway across the street in her pink robe phone glued to her ear. She turned slightly enough for me to hear. "Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious commercial vehicle," she said, voice sharp enough to cut steel. "It's been here all week. It doesn't belong. Possibly unlicensed. I don't feel safe." She looked right at me as she said it. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, heart pounding. 2 patrol cars showed up 15 minutes later. I remember how the neighbors peered out from behind curtains, how one guy across the street casually started watering his lawn at 6:30 a.m. Clearly, just wanting to watch. The officers were calm, professional. They asked for ID for registration for the vehicle's purpose. I complied. No sarcasm, no resistance. When I reached into my glove box and pulled out my FEMA-issued emergency volunteer badge and a printed list of scheduled food drop-offs, the older officer's brows lifted. "You're doing evac food runs?" he asked. I nodded. He stepped back, looking at the crates of bread in the back, the labels, the ice packs, the red-taped bins marked gluten-free, shelter only. His partner leaned in and muttered, "She didn't mention that." Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, fuming. The officer walked over to her. I couldn't hear the words exchanged, but I could see the way her shoulders stiffened, the way she turned red as a beet, and began waving her hands, pointing, arguing. Meanwhile, I stood there sipping lukewarm coffee, not sure whether to feel vindicated or exhausted. Eventually, the officers walked back to me, handed me back my paperwork, and said, "You're good. Thanks for what you're doing." Karen didn't say a word, but that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The next morning, I found a printed letter duct-taped to the side of my mailbox. Not slipped, and not mailed, taped. Bold red font at the top read, "Final warning," followed by a long paragraph of language that was half legalese, half passive aggression. The gist was clear: my truck violated Section 6.2 of the HOA's Covenant Code regarding commercial vehicles of industrial appearance, and if I didn't cease and desist, I'd incur daily fines of $250. It was signed by someone I hadn't heard of before. Darren Neal, HOA President. I stared at the letter, my breath fogging in the cool air, and thought about all the mornings I'd been up before sunrise to load that truck, about the elderly couple at the shelter in Riverglen, who'd told me my fresh rolls were the first warm thing they'd eaten in a week, about the shelter coordinator who'd cried after I brought extra loaves without being asked. And then I thought about this letter taped with smug authority to a cheap plastic mailbox, and I felt something harden in my chest. I went inside, scanned the letter, and emailed it to my contact at the county relief office. Jenny Trant, the logistics coordinator, who'd first brought me into the operation. She responded in 10 minutes. "Just ridiculous. Hang tight, we'll issue a new delivery credential that should shut them up. Also looping in county legal. Don't let them bully you." I appreciated her backup, but I knew enough about HOAs to realize that logic rarely won out when power and appearances were at stake. What Karen hadn't succeeded in doing with the cops, the HOA, was now attempting with bureaucracy. That day, I ran my usual route, but kept replaying the words "industrial appearance" in my head. My truck wasn't flashy. It didn't have logos. It was a repurposed delivery van painted soft cream white, with a few tasteful decals indicating food relief and the bakeries involved. Sure, it had a few cosmetic blemishes, some chipped paint, and one bent mirror, but it was clean, legal, insured, and registered, and parked on my own property. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday night. I had never been to one. I wasn't that kind of neighbor, but I knew I'd be attending this one. In the meantime, the passive aggression escalated. 3 days after the taped warning, I came home to find orange construction cones placed in front of my driveway. Not by the city, not by utility workers, just there, blocking access. I parked down the block and walked over. Karen, of course, was outside pruning her rose bushes with theatrical movements. She didn't look at me, but I could hear her voice loud and sharp. "Some people think the rules don't apply to them. Such a shame, really. Brings down the whole neighborhood." I kicked the cones aside and backed the truck in. The next morning, someone placed a flyer under my windshield wipers detailing alternative parking solutions for service vehicles. It was printed on HOA letterhead, again, complete with a map to an industrial park 3 miles away. That same day, I ran into Paul, one of the retired veterans who lived a few houses down. He'd always given me a nod in the mornings, but never talked much. This time he stepped closer as I loaded the truck. "Mind if I ask what this is all about?" he said, jerking his chin toward the truck. I explained. "The food relief, the shelters, the new fines." He listened, arms crossed, then looked down the street toward Karen's house and muttered, "Should have figured. She tried to report my grandkids for skateboarding once. HOA's been her personal kingdom since her husband moved out. He looked me over. You keep doing what you're doing. This town needs people like you more than it needs another lawn inspection. The quiet support meant more than I could say. When Tuesday came, I printed everything: delivery permits, emails from the county, photos of the shelters, even a thank you letter from one of the local churches. I walked into the HOA meeting with a manila folder under my arm and no illusions about how it would go. The meeting was held in the Fairmeadow Community Clubhouse, a faux colonial building that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and resentment. The room was full, mostly retirees, some couples, and the board members seated at a long table with Darren Neal at the center. Karen sat to his left, her eyes narrowing as I entered. I signed in, took a seat near the back, and waited. When they opened the floor for homeowner concerns, I stood. My name's Aaron Hill. I live on Ish Cedarbrook Lane. And I'd like to speak about the issue involving my delivery truck. Murmurs rippled through the room. Darren waved a hand. Please proceed. I laid it all out: what I did, who I worked with, how the truck was authorized by the county, and that I was distributing food to evacuees from the wildfires. Karen leaned forward. With all due respect, this is a residential neighborhood. We have codes for a reason. Visual consistency is part of our community values. I held up the thank you letter. So is compassion. And I'm not selling anything. I'm delivering basic food to people who've lost everything. Darren cleared his throat. Regardless of intention, the vehicle is commercial, and the bylaws are clear. I stepped closer. Then the bylaws need to evolve. Because right now they're punishing someone for helping people during a crisis. That line hit something. A few people nodded. One woman in the back actually clapped, but quickly stopped when Karen shot her a look. Darren looked uncomfortable. We'll take your concerns under review. That was it. No vote, no resolution, just vague promises. But something had shifted. I could feel it. The next morning, my truck had been egged. Just one egg, splattered across the windshield. But it said everything. The HOA wasn't backing down, and neither was I. I'd always believed that most people, given the full picture, would choose decency. Decency over control. That belief was starting to crack. 2 days after the HOA meeting, I came home from a delivery run to find a citation nailed to the tree in my front yard. Not tacked, not taped, nailed. A full sheet of paper laminated with bold black lettering that read, HOA Code Violation. Day 1, $250 fine. At the bottom, in all caps, it said non-compliant vehicle presence. The envelope it had been placed in was smeared with what looked like red lipstick. I didn't have to guess who had posted it. I pulled the paper down and stood there staring at the fresh puncture holes in the bark of a tree my dad had planted when I was a kid. That was the moment something inside me snapped, not in rage, not in vengeance, in clarity. They weren't going to stop. Not until I either bent or broke. That evening, I called Jenny again. They're escalating, I said. She didn't sound surprised. I've already looped in county legal. If they touch your truck, we'll bring civil action. Keep documentation, every notice, every photo, every voicemail. When I hung up, I began snapping pictures of the laminated citation of the nail in the tree of the tire tracks on my lawn that hadn't been there yesterday. Someone had driven past, fast and close. Petty, cowardly harassment. But the worst part came the next morning. I was getting ready to roll out. It was a Friday River Glen shelter day, and I had a full load ready to go. I had just closed the truck's back latch when I heard shouting, loud, directed. That truck is not supposed to be here. I turned around to see Karen charging across her lawn in leopard print leggings and a sweatshirt that read, I run this town. She had her phone in one hand, the other pointing at me like I'd just stolen a child. You're violating code. You were told to remove that thing. I didn't move. Karen, this truck is operating under emergency exemption. I don't care, she barked. You are disrupting this community, bringing in who knows who, and I'm tired of waking up to this industrial trash. She wasn't just loud. She was theatrical. Her voice echoed down the street. Curtains were pushed aside. Porches were quietly occupied. Karen knew exactly what she was doing, staging a performance. She didn't want a solution. She wanted a scene. And then she screamed the words I'll never forget. I'm calling 911 right now. I blinked. Karen, don't. But she already had her phone pressed to her ear. Yes, hello, this is an emergency. Yes, there's a suspicious vehicle in my neighborhood. A large white van, unmarked. The driver is outside. No, I don't feel safe. Yes, he's standing on his driveway, but he looks angry, aggressive. I think he might be threatening me. I stood perfectly still. I didn't even lift my hands. The worst part, I knew this was dangerous. I was a 27-year-old man with a beard and work boots, standing next to a box truck in a predominantly white neighborhood. Karen had just turned my morning into a potential headline. Within minutes, I heard sirens. I didn't flinch. I pulled out my phone and hit record. 2 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. One officer exited with a hand near his holster. The other more relaxed. I kept my voice even, my hands in full view. "Good morning, officers. My name's Aaron Hill. I have all my documents here." Karen stayed 10 feet away, still on the phone, muttering, "He's resisting. I don't feel safe. He's aggressive." I spoke calmly to the officers, showed them my driver's license, the vehicle registration, and then the FEMA badge. I explained that the truck was delivering bread to wildfire evacuees in Riverglen and had clearance from the county. The younger officer took my paperwork and stepped away to call it in. The older officer turned to Karen. "Ma'am, he said we're going to need you to end your call." Karen blinked. "What, I'm the one who reported him?" "Yes, ma'am. And you told dispatch there was a threat. But the individual has been fully compliant and his credentials check out." She gaped. "Credentials? He's got a truck in a residential zone. He's working with FEMA and the Osh County Emergency Office. That truck is covered under emergency exemption." Karen's face contorted into something tight and mean. "He's disturbing the peace. He leaves early, makes noise, parks that monster right on his lawn." I watched the officer nod slowly, then point to the windshield. "Ma'am, do you see that sticker on his windshield? The yellow one. That's issued by the Office of Disaster Relief. It's the same one we use when coordinating mobile aid deliveries." Her mouth opened closed. She looked at me like I had tricked her, like the story wasn't playing out the way she'd rehearsed it in her head. "Are you telling me," she said slowly, "that he's allowed to keep that truck here?" The officer's reply was flat and final. "Yes, he is." Silence hung between us. Karen's phone slipped to her side. Her dog barked from inside the house. For once, she didn't have a comeback. The officer turned to me. "Mr. Hill, sorry for the trouble. You're clear to go." I thanked him and climbed into the driver's seat. My hands were steady, but my chest burned with something between rage and relief. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Karen was frozen in the middle of the street, shoulder stiff, mouth slightly open, like she'd seen a ghost. That evening, after I'd made my deliveries and returned home, I parked the truck and sat in the driver's seat for a long while, engine off, lights dim. The adrenaline had worn off, but something hollow lingered in my chest. Not fear exactly, not even anger. Just that deep, weary recognition that some people would rather destroy you than admit they were wrong. I thought I was done with the day's drama until a second police cruiser pulled up around 9:12 p.m. This time, there were no sirens, no rush, just headlights cutting across my living room window like a spotlight in a theater. I stepped outside, heart sinking. I wasn't scared. I was exhausted. The officer who got out wasn't one of the ones from earlier that morning. He was older, mustached, and carried himself like someone who'd worked decades in the same zip code. He gave me a tired look, the kind a father might give a kid, who kept stepping in mud after being told not to. "You Aaron Hill?" "Yes, sir." "Mind if we talk a minute?" I nodded and led him up the driveway toward the truck. He didn't look like he was there to arrest anyone, but he was definitely there for something more than a courtesy check. He leaned against the hood of the cruiser, arms folded. "I'm Officer Redmond. I just got off the phone with HOA Board President Darren Neal." Of course, Darren, Karen's bureaucratic twin. Redmond sighed. "He asked me to pass along a formal reminder that the HOA intends to enforce fines if the truck remains on residential property overnight." I narrowed my eyes. "That's not a police matter." He nodded. "It isn't. That's why I'm standing here off the record, just relaying the message." I swallowed hard. "So they're using you as a messenger boy now?" His mouth twitched into a bitter half smile. "Been worse things." I opened the passenger side door, pulled out the yellow credential badge from FEMA, and handed it to him. "This is why I'm not moving the truck." He scanned it, then handed it back. "I saw your name come through dispatch earlier. You handled yourself well. I don't think you're in the wrong here. I just think you've kicked a beehive." I nodded. "I didn't mean to." "Well," he said, pushing off from the cruiser, "sometimes doing the right thing looks like defiance to people obsessed with control." He paused before getting back in the car. "You need anything real, you call us. Not the HOA, not that little tyrant with the poodle. Us." Then he drove away. I stood alone under the porch light badge still in hand, wondering how a town so quiet on the outside could be crawling with so much pettiness underneath. Over the next 2 days, I received 5 new violation notices. This time, they were stuffed into my doorframe and mailbox with increasing boldness. Day 2, $500. Fine. Day 3, $750. By Sunday, the number was $1,250, and I hadn't received a single formal invoice, just printed threats on stiff HOA paper. I started compiling everything. I scanned every document. I began a folder on my desktop titled Proof of Harassment. My contact at FEMA Jenny sent me a newly stamped certificate that reinforced my role as a disaster relief contractor. I printed it on thick cardstock and taped a copy to the driver's side window. Karen saw it the next morning. I was outside adjusting the load straps when I caught her staring from her porch. Her dog barked once. She ignored it. I didn't speak. I didn't wave. I just returned her gaze with a tired, steady calm that I hoped said I'm not going anywhere. Later that afternoon, I received an email from the HOA board. The subject line was or cease and desist final warning. The body of the email detailed a series of bylaw violations, accused me of diminishing neighborhood value, and demanded I either remove the vehicle or vacate the premises. They even attached a copy of the HOA charter, highlighted and annotated, trying to draw connections between their fine print and my existence. I forwarded the entire email chain to Jenny. She replied with a single line, "Time to bring in the county." Within 24 hours, I was contacted by a man named Harold Bixby from the County Office of Emergency Management. His voice was crisp-clipped and commanding in a way that reminded me of old coaches or military instructors. "Mr. Hill," he said, "we've reviewed your file. You're providing critical services under our coordination. The HOA has no jurisdiction over FEMA-registered relief operations during an active emergency." "Tell that to them," I muttered. "I will," he said, "in writing, publicly." I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't have to. The next morning, an official letter arrived, sealed in a county envelope, addressed to both me and the Bus Fairmeadow HOA board. It stated in clear legal terms that I was operating under a temporary county exemption, and that any further attempts to hinder my work would be considered obstruction of emergency aid under the HOA Disaster Response Code of State Law, Section 14C. I made copies. I taped one to my truck window. I taped another to my front door. And then, just for good measure, I printed a third copy and left it in Karen's mailbox. By that evening, the street was buzzing. A few neighbors I'd never spoken to approached me quietly, cautiously. One brought me iced tea. Another offered to help clean the egg splatter still baked onto my windshield from earlier that week. I didn't know, one woman said. "Karen made it sound like you were, I don't know, running some kind of business out of your house." I smiled gently, just feeding people. That night, I finally slept without checking the driveway every hour. But something told me Karen wasn't finished yet. The next morning began like so many before it, quiet, brisk, with that subtle smell of flour and faint yeast lingering from the previous day's deliveries. But this time, as I stood beside the bread truck, tightening the canvas over stacked crates, I noticed something I hadn't seen in weeks. Silence. No passive-aggressive leaflets, no cones in my driveway, no HOA clipboard patrols. Karen's window blinds were drawn, her porch empty. It was almost eerie. I checked my route for the day, 2 stops, both critical. The first was a mobile evacuee camp near Rockview Elementary, where nearly 60 families were being sheltered after the second wave of fires tore through nearby canyons. The second was a church in Somerset that had taken in over 30 seniors displaced from an assisted living center that had lost power. I cranked the ignition, the truck rumbled to life, and I pulled out slow, watching for anyone waiting with a phone camera. No one. Rockview was 35 minutes out. On the way, I played music low. Tracy Chapman. That one live acoustic album my dad loved. Her voice wrapped around me like a thread pulling memory tight. He'd taught me how to reverse park, how to change brake pads, how to work hard and not expect applause. He would have hated this HOA drama. He would have told me to stand tall, but don't let it make you bitter. When I arrived at the camp, the parking lot was half mud, half gravel. Tents lined the fences, some patched with tarps, some just canvas propped up by PVC and hope. Kids kicked a half-flat soccer ball near the corner, and a group of volunteers from the county sorted blankets and toiletry kits on folding tables. As soon as I opened the back of the truck, a volunteer named Alicia, wiry with quick hands and a faded baseball cap, came jogging up. She didn't smile so much as beam. "Oh my God, Aaron," she said, "we weren't sure you were going to make it today." The other guy canceled, said his HOA was threatening to tow. I shook my head. Well, mine tried. But I think they finally ran into something bigger than their clipboard. We unloaded as fast as we could bagged rolls, sandwich loaves, gluten-free packs, and a special order of cinnamon raisin bread a shelter manager had requested for a senior evacuee named Mrs. Daly, who hadn't eaten much all week. That kind of detail mattered. It always did. By the time we'd emptied the crates, a small line had already formed. Parents with children, teens in oversized hoodies. An old man with a rescue cat in a basket. They didn't look homeless. They looked like neighbors who'd been kicked out of their lives without warning. A boy, maybe 10 years old, watched me from the edge of the folding tables. His t-shirt was too thin for the morning chill. I nodded at him, held out a mini loaf. He hesitated, then took it with both hands. "My mom says you're the bread man." I grinned. "That's me." "Are you famous?" I laughed. "Only in neighborhoods with too many rules." He didn't know what that meant, but he smiled anyway, and I'll never forget how he tucked that loaf under his arm like it was treasure. I stayed for another 30 minutes, helping repack unused crates, sorting day-olds from the fresh. By the time I climbed back into the cab, my shoulders ached, but in the good way, like you'd carried something that mattered. The second stop was trickier. The church in Somerset had been flooded with evacuees after a local convalescent center was evacuated in the middle of the night. Many of the seniors were on strict diets, soft foods, low-sodium specific allergies. We'd packed carefully, separating everything with colored tags. I pulled in just before noon. A volunteer in scrubs waved me toward the back loading area. This one was quieter, heavier. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and stale air conditioning. Cots lined the walls. Nurses bustled in pairs. A man with a clipboard guided me to an auxiliary kitchen, where a cook with watery eyes nodded when she saw the crates. "We've been serving crackers and broth," she said. "This'll feel like a feast." I helped them unload in silence. A few of the residents peeked around corners, curious. One woman waved. Another just looked, face, slack eyes cloudy but searching. The cook motioned to a tray. "You want to stay for a bit?" I shook my head. "Got another pickup at 4, but thank you." As I walked back to the truck, I felt it again, that weightless warmth I could never describe properly. Like the silence that follows a song you didn't know you needed. Driving back into Fairmeadow that afternoon, I noticed something that made my foot ease up on the gas. A lawn sign. It stood in front of the Simmons house, just 3 doors down from mine. Hand-painted letters on a plain white board. "Thank you, bread guy." Underneath in red, "You fed our niece. She made it." I parked the truck, slowly blinked a few times, and stared at the sign like it was an illusion. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I hadn't even known the Simmons had family in the fires. I hadn't known they noticed. I stepped out of the truck and just stood there, air thick in my throat. Then a voice called out from the porch across the street. "You got a minute?" It was Paul, the retired vet, who'd once warned me about Karen. He held 2 folding chairs and a 6-pack of cream soda. We sat in silence for a bit before he finally spoke. "You're making a dent, you know." "In the HOA," he chuckled. "In people. The rest follows." I nodded, the knot in my chest loosening just a little. But I also knew something else. Karen wasn't the type to fade quietly. And neither, it seemed, was the HOA. The next day, I was up before dawn again, sipping burnt coffee in the driveway, the same way I had 100 times before. The air was cool dew, slicking the grass, and the sky was still a deep navy streaked with orange on the horizon. My bread truck sat beside me, humming low, fully loaded for another day of deliveries. I had just finished tightening the rear straps when I noticed Karen standing across the street. She was still in her robe this time, a cream-colored silk number with faux fur trim around the collar, and her arms were folded so tight across her chest, it looked like she might break her own ribs. Her mouth was a thin line, and even from that distance, I could feel the energy coming off her like heat from asphalt. She was trembling visibly, not with fear, but fury. Then she did something I didn't expect. She walked straight across the street. I straightened up, cautiously polite. "Morning." She ignored the greeting and stopped just feet away from me. Her eyes were puffy like she hadn't slept, and she held her phone in one hand like it was a weapon she hadn't decided whether to use. "This is harassment," she hissed. I blinked. "Sorry." "You're grandstanding. That sign, the letters, the photo someone posted of you handing out bread to children. This isn't community service, it's performance. Karen, I said carefully, I'm just doing the same thing I've been doing for weeks. No, you're trying to make us look bad. I held back a sigh. I didn't paint the sign. I didn't post the photo. That was your neighbor. You know, the one whose niece you tried to evict with your policies. Karen's jaw tightened. You think this is over because the county sent some letter, she said. You think a couple of handouts and pity tweets make you untouchable. I took a deep breath. No. But I do think maybe you should stop trying to fight people who are trying to help. Her voice rose. You don't belong here, you don't dress like the rest of us. Your truck is an eyesore and you've turned our peaceful community into some kind of bleeding heart circus. She was shouting now, and neighbors were starting to peek through blinds again. I've lived here for 17 years, she yelled. I have fought for this neighborhood. I have been president of the social committee, the garden tour, the 4th of July brunch, and I've been driving food to people who lost their homes. I cut in quietly, but firmly. Is that really what this is about? Your pride. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Karen's face cracked. Not with rage, at least not at first. With something deeper. Her shoulders sagged. Her lips trembled, and for a brief, startling second, she looked lost. Then she snapped. You think you're some kind of hero, she screamed. You think this makes you better than the rest of us. A door slammed nearby. Someone shouted, hey, take it inside. Karen spun around, red-faced, wild-eyed, and screamed, mind your business. Carl! Carl, 2 houses down, stuck his head out and said, it is my business. We're all sick of your tantrums. A second neighbor stepped out, then a third. I saw the news report, someone said. He's helping evacuees and you tried to get him fined. This neighborhood is supposed to be decent, Karen shrieked. It's supposed to be orderly, not filled with charity trucks and pity parades. Someone down the street muttered, loud enough to carry God she's unraveling. Karen turned back to me, breathing hard. For a moment, the fire in her eyes flickered. Not out of defeat, but exposure. She realized what she had done. She hadn't just screamed at me. She'd done it in front of the entire neighborhood. And now they weren't on her side. She stormed off without another word back to her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the shutters. I stood there unsure of what to feel. Vindicated, saddened, embarrassed. Maybe all of it. Paul walked over, slowly, arms crossed. Well, he said, that was climactic. She's going to say I provoked her. He nodded. She might. But that wasn't provocation. That was collapse. The next day, it all hit the news. Someone had filmed the whole exchange, Karen's accusations, her screaming fit, the neighbors speaking up. The video was posted online, and within 24 hours, it had over 30,000 views. Local outlets picked it up with headlines like, HOA President melts down over bread. Truck feeding fire evacuees. I didn't post it. I didn't comment. I didn't share. But the story spread anyway. People started showing up at my door, quiet, grateful faces, dropping off bags of flour, jars of preserves, handmade cards. One child brought me a drawing of the bread hero with a cape made of toast. An elderly woman from the next block brought a batch of warm cookies and said, I didn't know what you were doing. Now I do. Thank you. Even Darren from the HOA board finally broke his silence. He emailed me a short message. The board acknowledges the special circumstances surrounding your operation. We will be revisiting our code guidelines during the next meeting. Which translated from HOAEs meant, you win for now. Karen didn't come out for days. Her porch light stayed off. Her little dog barked and barked from behind the closed curtains. A part of me felt sorry for her. Another part of me hoped she'd finally stop trying to control the world one ticket at a time. Either way, something had shifted. And not just for me. For the whole neighborhood. If I'd hoped Karen's meltdown would bring closure, I underestimated the resiliency of those drunk on petty authority. Because while the public spectacle had clearly damaged her credibility, it hadn't broken the machine behind her. 3 days after her outburst, I received a certified envelope in the mail. Thick paper, gold. Fairmeadow HOA letterhead embossed at the top. Inside were 7 printed pages outlining alleged repeat code infractions, including everything from visual pollution to early morning noise violations to the almost laughable accusation of causing undue stress to adjacent property owners. The final page claimed I owed $350 in accumulated fines. They didn't even bother to reference the county's exemption letter. I sat in my kitchen reading it 3 times slowly as if somehow the words would change. They didn't. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was the entire HOA board digging in their heels. Maybe they were embarrassed. Maybe they wanted to reassert dominance after her public meltdown. Or maybe, like so many institutions, they just couldn't tolerate being challenged. Whatever the reason, the gloves were off. I called Jenny again. Her tone was sharp the moment she answered. Tell me they didn't. They did, I said. 3,000 plus. Formal letter. She sighed. I'll escalate to county council. This is intimidation now, and it crosses a line. But they're smart, I said. They're not fining me for the truck itself. They're couching it in neighborhood disturbance language. Still unconstitutional under emergency operations, she snapped. They're fishing, desperate. I hung up and exhaled, palms sweaty despite the air conditioning. The worst part wasn't the fines, it was the psychological war. The way they kept moving the target. As soon as one angle failed, they tried another. I felt like I was always reacting, always under siege. The next day, I woke up to find a drone hovering 20 feet above my driveway. It buzzed there, motionless, tiny red light blinking. I stared up at it for a long time, trying to suppress the instinct to grab a baseball bat. Instead, I pulled out my phone and recorded it. The footage showed the drone circling my truck, hovering over the license plate, then slowly ascending to Karen's roofline, where a man in slacks and a polo shirt stood operating a remote. It wasn't Karen this time. It was Darren Neal. I stared at him. He stared right back. He didn't wave. He didn't look away. He just calmly guided the drone back into a neat landing on Karen's porch. That night, I filed a complaint with the local police citing harassment and unauthorized aerial surveillance. Jenny looped in county legal again. They promised to send a cease and desist to the HOA board directly. But the pattern was clear. They were going to make my life miserable until I caved. The problem was, they didn't know what I'd already lived through. My dad's death, dropping out of college, working triple shifts while keeping my family afloat, driving through smoke zones without air conditioning, pulling into shelters to see kids without shoes eating from paper bowls. No laminated fine or drone could shake that resolve. Still, I won't lie, the pressure wore on me. I started having trouble sleeping. Kept waking up at 3 a.m. in cold sweat. Sure, someone was outside slashing my tires. I'd peek through the blinds, heart thudding, only to find an empty street bathed in street lamp light. Quiet calm. Too calm. Then came the new rule. The HOA issued an emergency amendment to their bylaws, one that hadn't been voted on, one that no resident had requested. It stated that all vehicles larger than a standard SUV must be stored in a covered enclosed structure not visible from the street. When I read the notice, my hands actually trembled. This wasn't subtle anymore. They were targeting me explicitly and brazenly, rewriting the rules mid-game to push me out. At that point, something inside me hardened. I drove to the county office in person wearing the same dusty jeans and faded hoodie I wore on every delivery. I asked for Harold Bixby, the emergency management official, who'd sent me the original protection letter. He met me in a back office cluttered with disaster maps and boxes of emergency kits. "You're Aaron," he said, standing and offering a firm handshake. "I've been hearing a lot about you." "I need help," I said. "They're changing laws just to make me leave." He sat down and looked at me square in the eye. "You ever consider going public?" I hesitated. "With what, my story?" "No," he said. "With the bigger story. You're not the only one getting targeted. I've got files from 4 different neighborhoods trying to penalize food trucks, mobile clinics, even emergency responders. All because someone on a HOA board doesn't like how they look." I blinked. "You're saying this is widespread?" He nodded. "HOAs with power and no oversight. You're just the one with the camera footage, the FEMA badge, and the receipts." That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't just my battle anymore. It was a pattern, a symptom, a cancer that had been allowed to grow unchecked behind neighborhood smiles and flower beds. "Would you be willing," Harold asked, "to let us tell your story at the next state-level emergency preparedness hearing?" I didn't even hesitate. "Yes." By the time I walked out of that office, I knew what was coming. There'd be more letters, more threats. But this time, I had more than a folder of evidence. I had a voice, and people were finally starting to listen. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered not by HOA courier or a smug neighbor, but by a county official in a Navy windbreaker who knocked gently, asked for me by name, and handed over a sealed envelope with a quiet, "They're not going to bother you much longer." Inside was a formal cease and desist order addressed to the Fair Meadow Homeowners Association. It was signed by the county legal counsel, stamped with the seal of the Office of Emergency Management. and written in no uncertain terms. Any further obstruction, harassment, or punitive action taken against Mr. Aaron Hill's state-registered relief vehicle shall be considered unlawful interference with emergency humanitarian operations. Failure to comply may result in civil penalties and immediate review of the HOA's charter by county oversight. The last line hit like thunder. If you wish to dispute this exemption, you may do so in court. I took a deep breath and leaned back against the wall, feeling the pressure in my chest ease for the first time in weeks. I walked outside and taped a fresh copy of the letter to the inside of the truck's front window, directly beneath my FEMA badge and my disaster delivery permit. It looked like armor, now a stack of credentials as tall as the HOA's list of complaints. Word traveled fast. That afternoon, I caught Darren standing at the edge of his driveway, jaw clenched as he stared at my truck. His khakis were ironed so perfectly they barely wrinkled when the wind picked up. He didn't say a word, but I didn't miss the twitch in his temple, or the defeat barely masked behind his neighborly frown. By sunset, two things had happened. First, the HOA posted a notice on the community board near the clubhouse, announcing that all scheduled fines would be placed under temporary review pending clarification of county policies. And second, more surprisingly, Karen's house went dark. Literally. The porch light that had been on since the Clinton administration was finally switched off. Her manicured garden, usually lit by tiny solar-powered fairies and LED garden gnomes, sat quiet and unlit. No barking dog. No shrill accusations across the hedges. It was unsettling. I thought I'd feel triumphant. Instead, I felt like I'd just watched a sparrow hit a window in slow motion. The next morning, I made my deliveries as usual. When I pulled back into the neighborhood that afternoon, I saw something new taped to the back of my mailbox, a handwritten note. Thank you for not giving up. My brother got food in River Glen because of you. CS. No name, just initials. I held the paper in both hands for a long time, the wind tugging at the corners. It was the first time someone inside the HOA, not an outsider, not a volunteer, but a fellow resident, had acknowledged what I was doing without whispers or shame. That night, the county invited me to speak at a town hall. They'd chosen Fairmeadow as the site. The auditorium wasn't huge, maybe 60 chairs, a folding table up front, and a borrowed PA system, but it was full. Not just officials and disaster response workers, but regular people. Neighbors, curious retirees. Even the teen skater kids Karen once tried to report for misuse of public walkways. I didn't prepare a speech. I just stood behind the microphone, looked out at the quiet waiting crowd, and told them the truth. About the fires, about the shelters, about the families who cried over stale bread and dry crackers because it was the first meal they'd had in days. About how it wasn't fame or politics or rebellion that made me do it. Just responsibility. Because if someone has the means to help and the heart to follow through and they choose not to, what does that make them? I didn't mention Karen, or Darren, or the HOA. I didn't need to. The silence after I finished was the kind that meant people were thinking. Then slowly applause, real rising echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Afterward, people came up, shook my hand, shared their stories. One woman from the next town over hugged me with tears in her eyes. You remind me of my son, she whispered. When I got home that night, another note was waiting for me. This one was under my windshield wiper, folded once carefully. I'm sorry. For everything. I was wrong. It was the smallest piece of paper, but the heaviest one I'd ever held. The next morning, she was gone. No warning, no announcement. A moving truck arrived at dawn. A quiet crew carried boxes and houseplants out the front door. Her dog barked once, then fell silent. By noon, the curtains were down and her porch light stayed off for good. Later that week, a new family moved in, young couple, 2 kids, a golden retriever. They waved from the driveway as I unloaded fresh sourdough for a local shelter. And for the first time, I waved back without hesitation. The HOA didn't say another word. The fines disappeared. The drone never flew again. But the neighborhood changed. Not in the way Karen feared chaos and anarchy in the form of bread and brown cardboard boxes. It changed quietly. Small flags went up on mailboxes. People started waving again, real waves, not just the stiff obligatory ones. One neighbor donated extra produce from their garden. Another offered me their shed to store crates when the truck overflowed. Even the newsletter changed. The next edition had a short blurb. Special thanks to Aaron Hill for his community service during recent emergencies. No title, no award, just acknowledgement. And sometimes that's enough. Sometimes all you need is to be seen. The neighborhood didn't talk about Karen's departure openly. Not at first. People avoided her name like it was a bad memory they were still digesting. But her absence created a vacuum, and vacuums have a way of pulling in truth. It started with whispers. Mrs. Renner, the widow 2 doors down, told me over the top of her rose bushes that Karen had actually been removed from the HOA board the morning after the town hall. Darren tried to keep it quiet, she said, voice low, but too many people showed up with questions. Paul confirmed it over cream sodas on my porch. She wasn't just facing complaints, there was a petition. Nearly half the neighborhood signed it in 2 days. By the following week, it wasn't whispers anymore. The local paper published a story with the headline, Fairmeadow resident harassed relief driver during disaster efforts. HOA faces county rebuke. My name wasn't in the headline, but it was in the article. So was Karen's and Darren's and a few other board members who had quietly stepped down for personal reasons. The article detailed the entire affair from Karen's 911 call to the drone surveillance, from the county's cease and desist to the town hall resolution. The story went viral on local Facebook groups. It was shared on neighborhood forums. Someone even sent it to a regional news outlet. That's when the emails started. First, from neighboring communities, people asking how I'd stood up to my HOA, if I could share my documentation, if I'd testify in their meetings. Then from journalists, emergency workers, even a woman in Arizona whose HOA had tried to fine her for housing hurricane evacuees in her garage. I never expected to become a symbol, but somehow I had. I tried to respond to every message. I shared copies of my permits, my timeline, the steps I took. People started calling it the bread truck blueprint. I never asked for that name, but I understood why they needed it. Because this wasn't about bread anymore. It was about boundaries, about kindness, about when rules stop being a framework and start becoming a cage. Meanwhile, in Fairmeadow, the shift became visible. HOA meetings were now public. Recordings were posted online. Residents had voting rights expanded. A new bylaw was passed that prohibited fines during declared states of emergency. And the biggest change, Darren resigned. The official letter was clipped to the community bulletin board outside the clubhouse after 11 years of dedicated service to the Fairmeadow HOA. I have decided to step down to focus on personal pursuits. Paul snorted when he read it. Yeah, like pursuing silence. His seat was filled by a schoolteacher named Monica Rivera. Soft-spoken, steady, and most importantly, a woman who'd volunteered at the same shelters I delivered to you. She reached out to me directly, asked if I'd be willing to advise the board on resilience and emergency cooperation. I laughed out loud. You want me on the HOA? She smiled. Not on it, just near it, close enough to keep us honest. I accepted, not out of spite, not to gloat, because if someone didn't sit at that table with both empathy and spine, it would all happen again. To someone else. I never saw Karen after she left. But I did receive one final note this time, not under my wiper or taped to a mailbox. It arrived in a stamped envelope, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. You were right. It was about my pride. I let it become something else. I'm sorry. No name, no signature, just closure. 1 month later, the shelter at River Glen closed. The fires were mostly out. Families returned home or tried to. Some never would. I stayed in touch with Alicia, the volunteer coordinator, and we worked out a plan to continue food deliveries bi-weekly, just in case. A quiet kind of preparedness. On the first weekend of October, the new HOA board hosted a block party. Nothing fancy, just a few tents, folding chairs, a rented bounce house, and potluck dishes lined up on folding tables. Someone brought a live band. Kids rode scooters. Neighbors laughed without looking over their shoulders. They asked me to bring bread, so I did. The truck pulled in just before noon. Cleaned, polished banner draped along the side that read, Fairmeadow Relief and Community Truck, all welcome. I didn't park in the shadows. I parked right in front of the clubhouse. People lined up not just for bread, but to say hi, to share stories, to thank me. A few of the older residents still gave me wary looks. That was okay. I wasn't there to change everyone, just to show that standing your ground doesn't have to mean standing alone. Midway through the event, Monica stood on a folding chair and tapped the mic. "I'd like to take a moment to recognize someone," she said. "Someone who reminded us what a neighborhood really is." My name was met with claps, then cheers. I nodded once. I didn't wave. I didn't make a speech. I just handed a fresh baguette to a little girl holding her dad's hand. And that was enough. Winter came late that year. The trees in Fairmeadow held their leaves a little longer than usual, and the morning frost took its time forming on the sidewalks. For the first time in a long while, I noticed the quiet again. Not the tense, brittle kind that hung in the air during those weeks of conflict, but a softer quiet. One that made room for breath. My bread truck still parked in the same spot, but now no one complained. A few neighbors even waved when I pulled in after a delivery run, and some of the younger kids gave me a thumbs up like I was some sort of rolling superhero. I started to recognize their names: Jake, Lily, and the shy one with the glasses, Marcy, who once left a thank you card shaped like a sandwich taped to my door. I was still running deliveries, though not every day now. The fires had abated and shelters had downsized, but the relationships I'd formed stuck. One of the churches I delivered to asked if I'd teach a weekend class for teens on community logistics, how to organize neighborhood relief, how to build distribution networks, how to show up before you're needed. I said yes without thinking. It felt good to give something more than food. It felt good to pass something on. By December, the Fairmeadow HOA had transformed more than I could have imagined. The new board rewrote several outdated bylaws and even held a neighborhood vote to approve a clause allowing emergency purpose vehicles to operate within HOA limits without penalty for up to 120 days post-disaster. They named it the Hill Clause. I never asked them to. They just did. Paul the veteran, who'd been my first ally, became a sort of local legend after organizing the first neighborhood-wide preparedness training. He kept calling it the bread truck protocol even when I begged him to stop. And Darren, well, I heard he moved 2 neighborhoods over into a gated community with tighter restrictions. No one really missed him. Karen, on the other hand, lingered in memory like a lesson too vivid to forget. People spoke of her differently now, not with hate, but with something approaching cautionary distance. She was what happened when control replaced compassion. And I knew deep down part of her had wanted to help once. Maybe life had made her forget how. But I hadn't forgotten what she taught me, that sometimes doing the right thing will make you a target. That helping quietly is louder than shouting. That justice doesn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it shows up in the form of a hand-delivered note or a child smiling over a warm piece of bread. On Christmas Eve, I received an unexpected visitor. Jenny from the county's office stood on my porch, holding a small box wrapped in brown paper. Her hair was tucked into a knit hat, cheeks pink from the cold. "You didn't have to come all the way out here," I said. She shrugged. It felt right. I opened the box inside. Inside was a plaque, plain wooden, hand-carved. It read, "For relentless service and unshakable integrity. To Aaron Hill, the one who delivered." There were no cameras, no speeches. Just that one sentence, simple and honest. I didn't cry, but my throat closed in a way that made speaking impossible. Jenny didn't wait for a reply. She just nodded once, then left me standing in the doorway holding something heavier than the wood itself. After she left, I sat on my porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the neighborhood lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing Nat King Cole, the music floating lazily into the night air. A couple walked by hand in hand. They waved. I waved back. Behind me, the bread truck sat silent. But it wasn't just a truck anymore. It was a statement, a reminder that sometimes a fight worth having isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet pushback, the firm no, the refusal to apologize for showing up for people who need you. I still live in Fairmeadow, still drive the same truck, still answer every knock on my door with the same open heart. And when people ask me what changed the neighborhood, I don't say my name. I don't mention the fines or the hearings or the drones or the drama. I just say, sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to be small. Then I hand them a loaf of warm sourdough, and I go back to work.